The first step to handle an exception is actually to notify its occurrence by means of the terminate event. However, if we really want to handle the exception, meaning that we want to take remedial actions in order to rectify the flow and bring it back to the normal flow, then we can do it by typically stopping a sub-process or some activity that is running and performing a special activity. So we further classify exceptions in BPMN into three types of exceptions: external, internal, and timeout. So this second classification is fully orthogonal to the first classification into business-related and IT-related exceptions. Depending on whether the exception is external, internal, or it is a timeout, we handle that by attaching an intermediate catching boundary event of a different type to the activity that we want to interrupt. Now, external exceptions are those that are triggered by the business environment, like in the example of the purchase order handling process, where the customer decides to send an order cancellation request. So in the case of an external exception, we attach an intermediate catching message event to catch this external message coming from outside the process boundaries. Internal ones, on the other hand, are triggered from within the process. For example, a product is not in stock. That may be considered as an exception. Or a product that has been ordered is actually discontinued. Or there is an error of some internal systems. In case of an internal exception, we use an error event, so an intermediate catching error event, which is represented with an empty lighting mark. And we have two subtypes of this event. One is the end error event, which is actually used to trigger the exception, and that has to be done from within the subprocess where the exception occurs, because this is an internal exception. And the intermediate catching error event, which can only be attached to the boundary of the activity that we want to stop. Finally, a third type of exception is due to an activity taking too long. So the activity times out. For the timeout, we use the intermediate catching timer event attached to the boundary of the activity. So the semantics of an intermediate catching event attached to the boundary of the activity is as follows. If the event occurs from the moment the activity is enabled to start until the activity is actually completed, so if it happens within that time frame, then the activity will be stopped and the so-called exception flow, which is the outgoing arc of this intermediate event, will be taken. And within this exception flow, we can perform any activity to handle the exception.